Hello, welcome again to the episode of the Let Fuel Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance, Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today we have another person who continues to be on the front line of making sure that taxes stay low, that they're not increased at all, and overall fighting for liberty, economic freedom, and so much more. It's none other than Patrick Gleason. Patrick, welcome to the Let Fuel Prosper show.
Hey, Vance, how you doing? Great to be with you.
Hey, I'm doing well. It's really a pleasure to have you on. You know, we've been friends for a long time and worked together on a number of things and are working together a lot right now, which we're going to get into about some, responsible state budgets. And so I want to go ahead and read first your bio, and then we can jump right in. So Patrick Gleason is Vice President of State Affairs at Americans for Tax Reform, a Washington-based advocacy and policy research organization founded in 1985 at the request of President Ronald Reagan. His writing and commentary have been published in The Economist, Reuters, Politico, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. He covers the intersection of state and federal policy and politics, and he's just a good guy, one of those happy warriors that are out there. And so, like I do with every one of the guests that I have on the Let Fuel Prosper show, Patrick, what motivates you to do what you do each and every day?
What motivates me to do what I do every day? Well, I would say, given being aware of the challenges we face around the country, both, with the federal entitlement programs get a lot of attention, but one thing that kind of keeps me up at night is state and local unfunded pension liabilities, making sure exorbitant liabilities and associated tax burdens aren't left behind to my daughter and to her, hopefully, many kids. And so, kind of the principle of leaving things better than we found it is something I'm a big believer in. And as someone who's been involved in state public policy going back to college, that's been my focus. And fiscal areas have been my main focus, but that's generally what's been motivating me is how to fix the problems that we have before us, how to address the challenges we have before us, and how to leave things better than we found it, because might be a controversial statement, because I think the boomer generation failed to do that. And so it's going to be incumbent upon the subsequent generations, Gen X, millennials, and below, to clean up some of the mess the boomers have left behind. So in addition to doing the many things that we would like to do and pursue, we have to address some of the problems, many of them created by the New Deal and Great Society, that we still need to deal with. So, the general theme is a lot of the big problems we are seeking to address, at least from the policy standpoint, are things that were created in the 1930s and 1960s. So, yeah,
no, that's right, Patrick. And it's unfortunate that we're having to deal with so much of it now, and we'll continue to do. But I'm glad you're on the front lines of doing that. What kind of got you into this? Like, how long have you been at ATR, and what has been kind of your role of getting into where you are today?
Yeah, so I first started getting involved in public policy and also got involved in politics to a certain extent pretty early, actually, going back to college, really. But before that, how I became politically aware or started being interested in policy was kind of a classic story you hear from a lot of people in our generation, which is was hearing my dad listen to Rush Limbaugh, being in the car, going to soccer practices, almost every soccer practice or any place we were going to in the car. During that time, my dad had Rush on. So from a pretty young age in grade school, was really starting to have that antenna up in terms of being interested in politics. So I was first interested in politics, and then subsequently in college and after got interested in public policy. And my first really foray in terms of state legislative engagement happened in college when I was a writer for the school newspaper, and I was one of our few right of center columnists. And it wasn't my main beat, but I started writing about some things that were happening in the state legislature. My school was located in the state capitol, and so wrote about some things that were happening there, and that was my first foray into that. And so that's kind of what brought me into that general zone. And then at the end of college, I had a choice to make. I was kind of torn between, do I want to do journalism, which I had been pursuing as writing for the school newspaper, or do I want to pursue government affairs? And I had, at the same time I was working at the school newspaper in college, I was doing a number of internships. I did some on Capitol Hill, some for a lobbying firm, some for the state Republican Party. So I was doing those alongside my work in in school, university, school newspaper work. And so didn't know whether I wanted to do journalism or government affairs, ended up going the government affairs route taking a job at a trade association. International Dairy Foods Association was my first job, working in ag policy, and then wound my way to beyond that number of twists and turns to where I am today at Americans for Tax Reform. And I kind of got fortunate in that I actually do get to do some journalism, even with my current gig, my main gig focused on public policy and government affairs. I do get to do a little journalism related to that. So it kind of worked out for the best.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know some about that, Patrick. So that's great to hear. And I think it shows in your writing and everything else, and how quick you are getting this information out there. And you write a lot at Forbes. You've got your contributor there. People, you hope the audience will go check that out. I'll be sure they put that in the show notes page. But you write a lot about what's going on with this flat tax revolution among the states. And I know that there is a lot that's happening. I was looking on the Tax Foundation's website on the number of states that have been doing something over the last couple of years. And I think this is so important because of our system of federalism that allows for this system of competition. I'm big on about institutional economics, and the institutions really help people to prosper, but they can also make them be poorer in the process too. What have you found has been, kind of eye-popping over the last couple of years with the state flat tax revolution that's been happening?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest policy trends that you touched on is what I call the flat tax revolution. And I'm biased, of course, because this is my focus of work, but I think it is one of the most significant policy trends anywhere in the country, federal and state, over the past decade or so. And it's really ramped up in the past few years. I would say it kicked off about a decade ago, actually exactly a decade ago, almost exactly. It was this summer in 2013 when North Carolina passed their landmark tax code overhaul, moving to a flat tax. And at the time, they became the 9th flat tax state in the country when they did that. They've subsequently improved that tax reform in the subsequent years where they've cut the rate further, but that was the first move to flat. So they became number 9. But actually they were flat tax state number 9, but only 4 states had ever passed legislation to move to a flat tax, because 5 states had always been flat tax. And 4 of those 9 states, like North Carolina, passed legislation to become flat tax states. So in all of U.S. history, only 4 states has legislation or a ballot measure been enacted to move to a flat tax. Well, in just the last 3 years alone, we've seen more than that amount move to a flat tax. We've seen 6 new flat tax states in the past, 5 new flat tax states just in the past 2 to 3 years alone. And so this trend has really ramped up, but it kicked off about a decade ago. And so some of the recent new flat tax states we've seen, Iowa, Arizona was one of the new ones. Georgia, their flat tax is getting ready to phase in, but it was enacted last year, signed into law by Governor Kemp. So you look at it, and it's a massive increase in the number of flat tax states. And if you look at between the number of both flat tax states and zero income tax states, so states that have a flat tax of 0 or higher, you're at almost half of the states in the country now. So this is real progress. We're almost at the tipping point, what I think, and I think we're going to see states move in this direction. And so that's something I want to highlight. We have seen, there was a setback in 2 instances, and that's important to highlight. So we saw 2 setbacks on both the flat tax front and the no income tax state front. So last November, a ballot measure was approved in Massachusetts. They were on a flat tax that moves them from a 5% flat tax to a state that has also a 9% tax that applies to income above $1 million, which also hits a large swath of the small business community. So we went from 14 flat tax states back to 13. But again, Massachusetts is the outlier, because we've gone, even with the loss of Massachusetts, we've had a 44% increase in flat tax states, going from 9 to 13, even with the loss of Massachusetts. Then you look at no income tax states, and we see some great progress made in states who are working to achieve that goal. That's their promised land, getting to join your state of Texas and being among the 8 no income tax states. And we've seen a lot of progress. That's the direction which lawmakers in a number of flat tax states, North Carolina, Arizona, Iowa, and some other places, lawmakers in those states have said, ultimately, that is where they would like to get to. We've seen a lot of progress heading in that direction. So you look in just the last handful of years, you've had 2 new true no-income tax states, because Tennessee and New Hampshire always had to have the asterisks because they didn't tax wage income, but they did tax investment income. Well, Tennessee lawmakers passed a phase-out of their investment income tax. That was completed 2 years ago. And then New Hampshire they passed, it was part of a recent budget, speeds up the phase out of their investment income tax. So instead of being phased out at the end of 2027, that'll now be gone at the end of next year, 2024. That'll bring us back to 8 true no income tax states. We would have been at 9, but we lost Washington State just recently because 2 years ago, their governor Jay Inslee signed into law a capital gains tax. So Washington State now has a tax on investment income. They don't tax wage income still for now, but they do have the camel's nose under the tent when it comes to income taxing, and they do have a capital gains tax. That was adjudicated, that was challenged in court. I was hopeful for a bit that might have been struck down in court because it violates the state constitution, or at least it seems to, based on a reading of that. But the state Supreme Court upheld that earlier this year. And so that now solidifies that as the end result there. So Washington now comes off the board. Really, really sad trombone taking Washington off the board on the no income tax state map. But the good news is we lost Washington one step back, but we've gone 2 steps forward in terms of the addition of 2 true no income tax states. So we're back at 8, and the question is, who's going to be no income tax state number 9 or 10? There's a number of prospects out there. I mentioned Arizona. That was a state where not only did they move to a flat tax, but taking effect at the beginning of this year is the lowest flat tax in the country at 2.5%. And there's legislation pending in that legislature now that would fully phase it out. It's already been passed through the state Senate, and it's pending in the state House. And it would phase it out over time. It would probably take over a decade, but seems like a reasonable approach in which it would say anytime the state has an ongoing, not one time, but a permanent ongoing surplus, we will take half of that ongoing surplus and apply that towards a buy down of the income tax rate. And it's estimated that could likely get, depending on revenue collections, that could get rid of their income tax, the remaining 2.5%, sometime in the next decade or so. So even the states that have been making some of this tremendous progress, they're not done. That's the good news. They're not resting on their laurels. They're continuing to pursue improvements to their tax code, like we're seeing in North Carolina with their budget that's pending. And part of that is because they see the competitive environment in states like the one you're in, Vance, Texas. They see the states that are already no income tax, the states that are already at the promised land that they're trying to achieve. So Tennessee, Texas, Florida, and they see lawmakers and governors in those states not lay off the gas and continue to find ways to provide tax relief and make their states more competitive. So I think not only are we in the middle of what we dubbed the flat tax revolution, but we are in sort of a golden era for state tax reform. I mentioned the big increase, the 44% increase in flat tax states, but in just the last 3 years, we've seen over 20 states cut their income tax. And these have passed with bipartisan support in many places, some signed into law by Democratic governors, but also many receiving considerable large bipartisan votes. I mean, the Georgia flat tax received a vote was supported by almost every Democrat in the Georgia legislature. Every Democrat in the Mississippi House of Representatives has voted to completely phase out their income tax. So these things are getting bipartisan support. And so, that's just in a nutshell is some of the tremendous progress we've seen.
Yeah, no, that's phenomenal. And thank you for all the work that you've been doing on this for a number of years. It's kind of like one of those big tipping points, like you said, to where you really start to see a lot of these states start to compete. And it's so important. I mean, I think there was a lot driving maybe over the last couple of years. Part of it is that people started to move with COVID and the shutdowns. I think you saw that a lot of people from like California are moving to Texas and other places in the South. But they also had an influx of income, coming in, of tax revenue in that sense, as they were bringing in, there was a lot of money that was put out there by the federal government, increase in the national debt. Now we've had 31.4 plus trillion dollars in national debt there now. And so there was some people that are suspect about the sustainability, right, of some of these tax reforms and tax cuts that have been put in place. But it seems like, don't you correct me if I'm wrong, that these states have learned the lessons from the kind of the Kansas issue that happened during the aughts, to where they cut their taxes. They started running deficits because they continued to spend quite a bit and not rein in their spending. And then they raised taxes later. But it seems like you said earlier, where, states are using the surplus, going that route. So that's already an increase in a revenue that's coming in above the amount of spending. So that's the new base of revenue. It doesn't mean that money is just going to go away whenever the revenue starts to fall, because that's the new base based on what's the economy and the income that's coming in overall. And so I wonder what else that you've seen to where states are taking good steps to say, you know what, we're going to cut our taxes, but we're also going to make sure that we're reining in government spending, or doing other measures that will make this sustainable over time and not fall into the Kansas trap.
Yeah. So you pointed to the influx of revenues states have seen, some of that coming from the federal government, but some just coming from better than expected revenue projections. And that has certainly been a factor that has helped the big increase in the number of tax cuts we've seen in the state level, both in red and even some blue states. And that's certainly been helpful. But a lot of that, but also part of the reason states are in a good position to provide tax relief and have been for the last few years. It's not just the federal revenue, although that's certainly helped, but it is, as you mentioned, learning from some of the bad examples or some of the mistakes. You touch on Kansas, and I think that's important to highlight because it was held up for, and it is still even to this day, held up by some in the media, some pundits and politicians and campaign operative types as a bad example of what not to do. And it is an example of what not to do, Kansas, and what they did about a decade ago. But but not for the reasons that it's been portrayed in the media. They try to claim, well, they cut taxes too much, and that's why you should not cut any tax. But it's a very lazy argument, but we see it nonetheless. And we see the but Kansas argument applied to all manner of tax cuts, even ones that have no relation to what happened in Kansas. But so while some dubious lessons are posited, I would say the real lesson learned from Kansas is the importance of keeping spending in check at the same time you're cutting taxes. And we've seen lawmakers respond to that and learn from Kansas's lesson in a couple ways. The most obvious way is to keep spending in check, and I'll get to that in a second. But one other key way is with the mechanism of revenue triggers, which have increased in popularity and is a provision that I have recommended to legislators who are pursuing or considering rate-reducing tax reform. And revenue triggers, we do believe, addresses concerns about biting off more than you can chew, provided you set the revenue triggers in a well-designed manner. And so revenue triggers make it so you can schedule out reduction in whether it's personal income or corporate or other tax rates, and those rates will take effect in the coming years, provided you hit certain revenue levels. That's how the flat tax, the 2.5% that just took effect in Arizona, that's how that was achieved in Arizona via revenue triggers. And so we've seen it. That's how the corporate tax drawdown in North Carolina was achieved with revenue triggers. And that's how we've seen rate-reducing tax reform implemented in a number of states. So we think revenue triggers is a good way to implement tax reform responsibly. So if some unintended downturn in state revenue collections happens, we don't find ourselves in a position where where lawmakers are talking about raising taxes to make up for the difference, or unanticipated reductions in spending that might not be a good idea, or at least might not be best made in a pinch. So we don't find ourselves in those circumstances. Revenue triggers, we think, is a good way to make sure you don't run into that situation. So that, coupled with making sure you're not spending too much, which Kansas did at the same time they cut taxes. And so that's why ATR has been and is getting ready to even more so increase our focus on spending restraint, because spending restraint not only puts states in a position to pass rate-reducing tax reform, like we've seen with a number of states. I mean, some of the states that have passed some of these tax reform bills that we consider models, states like North Carolina and Arizona, have done so with the help of spending restraint, where they've kept spending state spending growth at a responsible clip. And given the need to put yourself in that position so you can cut taxes, but also because we've had so much success in cutting tax rates, that we don't want states to find themselves whether they have a revenue downturn that has nothing to do with the tax cut, but could get attributed to that tax cut wrongly. Because of concern for those potential scenarios, it's even more important, to keep spending in check. You should do that anyways, but even more so when someone's going to falsely accuse the tax cut you enacted a couple of years ago of being the result for that. Now, if lawmakers in some of these states that have cut taxes recently don't keep spending in check, and they do run into budget problems because they've been profligate with their spending, that's something they need to address. But if state legislators who have cut taxes are also keeping spending in check, we think they will find themselves in a good budget scenario and will not run into some of the problems that other states might have that are spending beyond their means.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think we have seen a lot of the revenue triggers being used over the last few years. Even in Louisiana, where I'm doing some work with the Pelican Institute, they put in some revenue triggers in 2021, which did trigger initially and brought down the personal income tax tax and the corporate franchise tax. And there we're working on flattening and then eliminating those over time. And I think it's going to be a process. This session there, they didn't hit one of the revenue triggers. They've got 3 revenue triggers. They didn't hit one because they didn't want to put more money into the rainy day fund. They only needed about, I think, $50 million more dollars. They could have put that, and they had a massive amount of surplus that was available. And it brings me, to question a little bit about the revenue trigger, just in the sense that it's focused more on the revenue side and not on the spending side. You know me, Patrick, like I'm always going back to the spending, and we need to make sure that the spending is in check, which is one reason why, like, I've been working really hard in Texas over the years of putting in a surplus trigger, if you will, to use for property tax relief. If they spend above or keep spending restrained to population growth plus inflation, you've got all this additional revenue to where we don't have to have a certain amount of money in different places. It's just that, look, this is extra money, excess taxes that have been collected that should be returned to the taxpayer. It does add a little bit more pressure on them, I think, because they need to keep spending in check, and not everywhere can do that. But I think between the two, it seems like a good avenue to go down, where the focus is on how to give money back to the people, right? That's where it's going to be most productive, whether investment or for families or whoever else, instead of it being spent by the government on, a lot of fruitless endeavors at the end of the day. Look, like, they're going to spend money on education and healthcare and some other places, but let's make sure it's spent wisely, where you have performance-based, it's sort of audits that are done, or if you have zero-based budgeting. A lot of these key budgeting mechanisms, I think, can help to keep spending down, so that way we have the most amount of money that's being provided. In Texas right now, where the legislative session ended, we have a special session right now of property taxes, and there's a big discussion between the governor, lieutenant governor, and others about what's the best path forward. And Patrick, is I think there's some concern, right, about the state using funds to buy down or reduce local property taxes. And you and I've talked about this a lot. I mean, philosophically, I think I'm in this situation where I would like for local government should be left alone, let them do what they're going to do. If they're going to run up taxes, then that's their problem. Elections have consequences. Let's focus on that. But one thing in Texas, it's different. And you and I have talked about this for a while, is where Texas, basically the state determines those school finance formulas that then to send the money out, at least the maintenance and operations portions, to all the schools across the state. And so in that sense, it is essentially a statewide property tax. In fact, the Supreme Court's found it a statewide property tax a couple times, and then they voted to have changes to it. But the last one, the really big one, was in 2006, where they reduced the rates from $1.50 per $100 valuation down to $1. That was the $14.2 billion tax relief back then. They did that by raising taxes at the same time. And I think that's where the discussion is now, is how do you do this again to make sure it's the most relief? And that's where the compression's coming in. Texas has like $33 billion in surplus. And so, but I think there should be spending restraint, spending limits at the local level, and other ways to really keep those property taxes down at the local level, or they're just all going to come back up again, which goes back into the state problem of Kansas and others, where spending is the main problem that we have going on here. So we'll see what happens in Texas and some of these other states. But I think it's really important, the work that you've been doing and others at ATR, of making sure that we have the best sustainable situation possible within these economies. Because if not, we're going to end up in the same place. And, the next thing I'd like to talk about, Patrick, is, we're working on this responsible state budget project, where we're looking at spending limits and putting this out there on ATR's website. And I just wondered if you have anything, what your thoughts are about that, and anything you want to say about Texas or other states. But I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so that's going to be one of our next major focuses in Americans for Tax Reform, addressing the problem of spending too much. Because I'll tell you, Vance, the story. People have approached us, Americans for Tax Reform, for years, knowing us as the group that puts out the pledge to not raise taxes. And people have come to us for years and said, hey, we need a pledge like that for overspending. And the problem with that, and why we've never had a spending pledge, is because there is no binary metric like there is with, does a bill raise taxes or not? Does a proposal raise taxes or not? And so spend too much. What is spending too much is a little more of a subjective metric. And so that's why it's been hard to put that in place or in writing, at least in a pledge form. But I think the closest, at least in my opinion and the opinion of Americans for Tax Reform, that you can come to getting a binary metric for what is spending too much and what is not spending too much is the metric that the Responsible Budget Project is about, which is population growth plus inflation. And it's a pretty basic metric, but we think it is the best way to determine whether a state is spending above or below or within its means. And And that is determined by population plus inflation. So we're getting ready, as you know, Vance, so we're going to be highlighting that a lot this summer, looking at the states, how they've been growing spending, how that is compared to population growth plus inflation in those states. So a few states have some good stories to tell. Most states do not. And, not only does that give you more of a binary metric in terms of are we spending too much or not, it gives you a goal to shoot for, a top line figure, both in terms of, total state outlays, general fund, all the above. You can give yourself a baseline to shoot for, which you did not have before. And yes, there are thousands more and more even decisions that lawmakers need to make that determine whether a state's spending trajectory is above or below that baseline of responsible budget. But at least when it comes to having that metric and having that goal to judge success by, we think is important. And so the Responsible Budget Project is about defining that metric and defining, that determination so people have a better sense. And then from there, you can have conversations about what are the reforms that we can implement, whether it's in the healthcare space or the energy space or the tech and telecom space, that we can implement that are going to help the state stay below this trajectory, to enact responsible budgets, to live within its means, and also do a good job of providing its core functions and services. So that's what we're going to be focused on. And, we'll be highlighting a specific website later this month. And I'm really excited about that. But I will just mention, too, it also puts a number to the line that you often hear, which is, and you hear it a lot from conservatives like myself when we're fighting proposals and legislation that would raise taxes, and we'll say, look, the state does not have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. And you hear it so much, it almost sounds cliche, but here's the thing. It's true in pretty much every state, and certainly true in the federal government. And I think the numbers that we're going to be promoting this summer and educating the public and lawmakers about, in terms of showing where their budget is today, where it would be had they simply kept growth of state spending in line with population growth plus inflation, you'll see how many X billions of dollars less each state's budget would be today. And that will quantify for you that state's overspending problem. You'll be able to have an actual figure. So this puts a number two and meat on the bones of the line that we've heard for years, which is the state doesn't have a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. And so we're going to have concrete numbers behind that. So someone from, California can look up and say, holy smokes, if we had, I knew we were spending too much and I knew that we were taxing too much, but if we had simply grown, and we're not even talking about cutting, we're not talking about any cuts in state and local spending. We're talking about simply more modest rate of increase. If we had simply grown state spending in line with population growth plus inflation, look at how many billions less our budget would be today. And what that translates into, look how many more billions in dollars would be in taxpayers' pockets, or could be in taxpayers' pockets today in the productive economy today. That could be families' bank accounts, could be used to hire new workers, give existing workers raises. Because we are spending too much, that is what we are keeping out of household balance sheets and business balance sheets. So we are going to be focusing more on that. We think it will give us a binary metric that lawmakers can use to determine whether their next budget they're looking at is spending too much or not spending too much. So I'm really excited about this new project. And the good news is it's not all bad stories to tell. So there are some places that have some good stories to tell. And we're going to be telling those and how those states have achieved those. That's going to be a big focus for the summer.
Yeah, no, it's going to be great. I'm excited about it. And I should let the audience know I'm a senior fellow with Americans for Tax Reform. So we're working together on this, and it's been really exciting. And, it's something that I've talked a lot about on the program and other episodes of kind of the gold standard where we have with the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in Colorado and how they use that. It's been watered down over time. It's not as strong as it used to be, but this really set the stage for population growth plus inflation, which is a good measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending. It's based on the population growth, the number of people who can pay for government, along with inflation, which is usually tied to wages, not as much in the last couple of years, but usually tied to wages. So if you have people and you have wages, that's who could pay for government. I'm not worried about an appropriator side saying how much do we need to spend on government, because their view is that they always want to spend more, but it's always coming out of the productive private sector. So we've got to make sure we have a limit that keeps them restrained. And that's what the Responsible State Budget Project will do. And there's going to be 50 states. Like, you just go on the map and you click on it and it'll have information about what the responsible budget is for the upcoming budget cycle, which is great, how it compares over time over the last last decade. It'll have what per capita, what the increase is, also per family, what the increase has been just in the current budget, but also cumulatively over the last decade, to Patrick's point of how much more could be in people's pockets compared to government spending. And then there's going to be a number of other facts and figures from the Tax Foundation, from ALEC, from ATR, from the BLS, just Bureau of Labor Statistics, of a lot of good data for each one of these states. So I think it's going to be a great reference point for legislators who are listening, for the average person, just anyone, think tankers to go to find where this information is going to be, because this is going to be the one-stop shop, I think, for a lot of good information of what the institutional framework is and how people are prospering, across the state. And so just in the last couple of minutes here, Patrick, that we have together, and we're recording this on June 14th, 2023, after a lot of these sessions are now over, are there any other big things that you would have liked to see or saw this legislative session that you'd like to note?
Yeah, so I would highlight a couple things. A lot of good things happened. So I don't want to dwell on the negative. A lot of really good things happened. A lot more tax relief was passed this year. Actually, we might still see some more before the end of summer. North Carolina is getting ready to enact a final budget, which is very likely to include further rate reduction. And the Senate passed version of their budget last month would bring their flat tax below Arizona. So we'd have a new lowest flat tax state. And so the new budget will make some progress, though, in chipping away on that path to zero. In Wisconsin, there's still efforts there underway to get income tax relief enacted as part of their budget. Their Senate president had introduced a flat tax proposal. Doesn't look like they're going to be able to get all the way there, but we should be able to get some tax relief done. So there's still some opportunities out there. We've seen also, I shouldn't just focus on the tax front, because there's been progress on a number of other major issue areas that entail major victories for conservatives with school choice. We've now have 7 universal school choice states, with some form of school choice expansion legislation passing in many more states than that, and including states where this has been years in the making. And we hope to see Texas join that trend later this year in a special session. So there's been progress on that front. Also, a lot of progress on labor reforms. We've gone from a decade ago, there was 22 right-to-work states, and we've gone from 22 to 27, and just back to 26, actually, because Michigan repealed. But even with the loss of Michigan, 22 to 26 percentage-wise is a huge increase in the number of right-to-work states, now taking us to more than half of the country as a right-to-work state. And we've also seen an increase in the number of states that have paycheck protection laws, where the government will not automatically deduct union dues and will no longer serve as the money bag man for unions, have passed in 3 states this year. And so we've seen progress on that front, and also licensing reform. Arizona, 4 years ago, became the first state with universal licensure, universal license recognition, universal reciprocity, however you want to call it, when Doug Ducey signed that. We went from 1 that year, the first, to now we have nearly 20. So tremendous progress in terms of freedom of people to move from one state to another and to be able to continue earning a living and not having to wait and go through bureaucratic red tape. But in terms of a lot of missed opportunities, I'm bummed we weren't able to get full repeal of Tennessee's professional privilege tax done this year. Hopefully we can get that done next year. Texas, Vance, your state, is the one where hopefully the property tax relief deal can be negotiated, and hopefully school choice can get done. If those don't get done, those might be the biggest missed opportunities in the country at the state level. So those are big ifs. I would highlight out there. And then maybe I would include in there inability to pass education savings account legislation in Georgia, where we only fell 3 votes short. And so it's really unfortunate. But the good news is the forces that support school choice are already planning to play in those elections and those primaries next year, so that we can come back with a legislative makeup that will be more inclined to pass ESA legislation. So who knows, that could happen in Texas if they can't get ESA legislation done in the special session. As Governor Kim Reynolds showed us in Iowa, she went and primaried about 6 Republicans because they opposed her ESA legislation. She went and primaried them last year, and now I came back and was able to pass her ESA legislation. Who knows? Maybe Governor Craig Abbott's going to have to do something similar. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope they are able to pass school choice in the special, but who knows? It's had to play out that way in other states. That's something we're seeing out there. So yeah, those in terms of some of where there's still opportunities out there, still on the table, and also some that were missed for this year that I hope we get next year.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, I always appreciate your optimism, even when there are some things that we're not as excited about or where they don't go through. You always keep optimistic. And I appreciate that about you. And I'm hopeful, too, that Texas will do something big on property tax relief. They've got to do that. I mean, Texas has got to lead the way. The largest red state in the nation. Florida keeps moving forward, Tennessee and others, so they've got to do something there. And school choice, you're so right. I mean, I think what we've seen has been kind of this trio of things that I've been talking about where you have, state flat tax revolution, school choice revolution. Now we need the responsible state budget revolution. And I think if we get those three, man, families and entrepreneurs are going to flourish more than we've ever seen before. We're going to see businesses come out right and left. We're going to see families be able to afford whatever they want to. I mean, this is going to really bring about a great revolution for more prosperity, more freedom, and more liberty that at the end of the day is going to help people be better off. So I really appreciate all the work that you're doing and others at Americans for Tax Reform. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Patrick, and God bless you and your family. Thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me, Vance. Great to see you.
All right. And so until next time, audience, please go and give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to wherever you watch this, whether it's on YouTube or listen to it on any of the other platforms. Thank you for joining us today. And until next time, let people prosper.